Hello, my name is Derek Atkins, and this is part two of the lecture on telling the better story, sexuality and gender. So in the first part of this video lecture, we looked at the historical background to the LGBTQ movement. We saw how that movement began. We also looked at some contemporary understandings of sexuality and gender. In this second part, we are going to look at some LGBTQ critiques of what the Bible says about gender and sexuality. And then we're going to look at what the Bible actually does say about human sexuality and gender. And so these two videos will together help lay the groundwork for our third video, in which we are going to we're going to explore developing a strategy for telling the better story about human sexuality and gender. Let's begin by looking at some biblical passages on homosexuality. Your reading assignment for this lesson covers most of the biblical passages that mention homosexuality. Here, I will review these passages since repetition can help us to consolidate our understanding of biblical teaching about homosexuality and other LGBTQ matters. As we review these passages, we'll examine how LGBTQ apologists interpret these passages and how we can respond to these misinterpretations of Scripture. The first passage I want us to look at is Genesis chapter 19, verses 1 through 29. This is the passage about the visit of two angels to the city of Sodom, where Abraham's nephew Lot lived. While the angels stayed in Lot's home, men from all over Sodom came to Lot's house and demanded to have sex with the two guests. Lot refused to give the crowd what they wanted and instead offered to give them his two virgin daughters. LGBTQ theologians argue that what is condemned here is not consensual homosexual intercourse, since there was nothing consensual about the crowd's demand to have sex with the two guests in the first place. But they contend that what is condemned here is the violation of a moral obligation to provide hospitality. Since ancient times, most Middle Eastern cultures have insisted on a strong moral obligation to provide hospitality to visitors and other strangers. Middle Eastern hospitality in both ancient and modern times included an obligation to provide protection for one's guests. However, when one looks at this passage, one sees that Lot clearly provided protection for the two angels, while at the same time offering up his two daughters to the crowd, who would have presumably gang raped them. As twisted as Lot's actions were in this situation, he nonetheless clearly upheld the moral obligation to provide hospitality for his guests. According to the biblical text, the men of Sodom clearly wanted to have sex with the visitors, and even when offered women instead, the men of Sodom continued to insist on having sex with Lot's guests. This clearly indicates that one of the sins that God judged Sodom and Gomorrah for was the sin of homosexuality. The next passages I want us to look at are Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. These two verses explicitly prohibit same-sex intercourse. In fact, Leviticus 20:13 commands that men who are guilty of same-sex intercourse should be put to death. Progressive theologians argue that these verses are part of the Hebrew holiness code, which was done away with by Christ's fulfillment of the law. For example, the holiness code also includes commands to practice circumcision and to prepare and eat only kosher foods. These progressive theologians argue that since Christians are no longer practice circumcision nor eating only kosher food, they are also not bound by the prohibition against same-sex intercourse. However, the passages that include Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 also include prohibitions on many other sexual activities, including incest, adultery, and bestiality, not only because such activities makes a person ritually impure, but also precisely because they are immoral. Therefore, Christians in the first century and since then have continued to oppose same-sex behavior on ground that such behavior is immoral, even while no longer practicing circumcision or eating kosher food. Next, let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, and 1 Timothy 1:10. In 1 Corinthians 6, 9 to 11, Paul lists those who will not enter the kingdom of heaven, while in 1 Timothy 1:10, Paul gives a list of those who rebel against God's teaching and for whom the law was given. According to LGBTQ theologians, these verses use the Greek word malakoi, which refers to male prostitutes, and arsenokoitais to refer to heterosexual males who were sexually abusing younger males, which were both common practices in Paul's day. Furthermore, they specifically argue that Paul created the word arsenokoitai and could have used one of any other Greek word then commonly used to describe homosexual activity in general. LGBTQ theologians go on to say that these verses are not referring to same-sex intercourse between two consenting adults. Therefore, the argument goes, these verses have nothing to do with present-day LGBTQ practices, since present-day practices involve non-heterosexual sex between consenting adults. Notice what LGBTQ theologians are trying to do here. They are trying to narrow the biblical definition of same-sex activity to argue that the sexual practices Paul refers to is not the same as modern-day same-sex practices. They, and many others who promote modern sexual ethics, are trying to make consent the key factor in determining whether any sexual activity is morally acceptable or not. Consent is definitely an important factor in any sexual ethic, but sexual ethics does not end with consent. It goes far beyond mere consent to ask questions like, is this activity truly beneficial to those who engage in it? And what impact does this activity have on others outside this relationship? In the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament that Paul used, the word arsenokoitai is used in both Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13. Thus, we see that Paul didn't simply create a made-up word, but he used a word that was already considered part of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Therefore, while Paul's list of wrongdoers certainly included male prostitutes and heterosexual men who sexually abused younger males, it also includes any kind of same-sex intercourse. Now we come to Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 32. This passage describes God's wrath upon the ungodly and includes verses 26 and 27, in which God describes how women have exchanged natural relations to have sex with other women, and how men have given up natural relations to have sex with other men. Liberal or progressive theologians point out that the context for the entire passage of Romans 1, 18 to 32 is the sin of idolatry. They argue that what Paul was arguing against was excessive lust and not same-sex intercourse. Again, the argument is put forward that today's practice of loving, committed same-sex behavior between consenting adults is not what Paul had in mind when he wrote these words, and therefore Paul is not really condemning same-sex behavior. LGBTQ theologians also argue that Paul's condemnation of same-sex behavior was rooted in the patriarchal, misogynistic society he grew up in, and therefore is no longer an appropriate interpretation, because this interpretation is no longer relevant to today's society. We see here that one of the key questions in today's debate about biblical teachings on sexuality and gender is whether or not the Bible's teachings, regarding gender and sexual behavior are culturally bound, or whether they are true at all times for all people in all circumstances. When we examine this passage, we know that the context for this passage is indeed idolatry. However, Paul roots his argument in creation itself, telling his readers that human sinfulness, including homosexual practices, is the result of humanity's rebellion against the Creator. For example, in verse 20, Paul writes of how God's invisible qualities have been made known from the beginning of creation. In verse 23, Paul describes how rebellious humans stopped worshiping the immortal Creator and began to worship idols that are made to look like created things. In short, people went from worshiping the divine Creator to worshiping the created. Now, we should remember that in Paul's day, it was common practice to declare Roman emperors to be divine once they died, and later still, Roman emperors increasingly began to take on the title of divine even while living. And then in verses 26 and 27, Paul uses the words natural and unnatural to draw a contrast between sexual relations between men and women, which are natural, and sexual relations between people of the same sex, which are unnatural. Therefore, when humans become involved in same-sex behavior, they are rebelling against the Creator's design for the created order. Nor does Paul single out homosexual behavior in this passage. Instead, homosexual behavior is one more result of humanity's rebellion against God, one more consequence of humans' refusal to worship the divine Creator. In verse 18, Paul writes, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men." In verse 23, Paul describes the practice of polytheism, in which humans worship images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. The practice of polytheism was nearly universal in Paul's day, with the Jewish nation and the emerging Christian community being two of the rare exceptions. So we see how Paul's words are meant to be applied to all people in all places at all times and in all circumstances. Within this context, Paul's condemnation of same-sex behavior is a universal statement rather than limited to the historical setting of Paul's own day and place. Now that we've looked at LGBTQ interpretations of various biblical passages regarding same-sex practices and Christian responses to these interpretations, let's look at the agenda of the LGBTQ movement. Some LGBTQ activists would like for us to believe that gays, lesbians, bisexual, and transgenders have no agenda beyond simple acceptance of their lifestyle. But this is far from true. The LGBTQ movement definitely has an agenda that they are pursuing, and they definitely have a game plan that they are following. First, we'll look at what this agenda is for the LGBTQ movement as a whole. Then we'll look at how this agenda plays out on a personal level, especially with the current emphasis on transgender rights. So let's look at the cultural agenda. The first step in the cultural agenda of the LGBTQ movement is to normalize LGBTQ people, LGBTQ behavior, etc. This is a process that has been going on literally for decades. Hollywood and the rest of the entertainment industry is a major part of this process, and LGBTQ activists have consistently pushed their agenda in movies, TV shows, books, podcasts, comics, etc. They do this by putting characters who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender into a wide variety of stories. The goal here is to make such people and their behavior seem normal. Almost every American TV show since 1990 has at least one gay or lesbian character. The executives at Walt Disney have reportedly made the decision to include minority or LGBTQ characters in at least 50% of all Disney shows and movies starting in the year 2022. So that's the first step in the cultural agenda. The second step in the cultural agenda is to label those who oppose LGBTQ people and behavior as hurtful and hateful. Those who oppose the LGBTQ movement are equated to being like Nazis, skinheads, or the KKK, which was the white supremacist Ku Klux Klan. The goal of this strategy is to create a climate of shame for those who are opposed to LGBTQ behavior. One reason why this strategy is so effective is because perhaps some Christians have been truly narrow-minded, bigoted, hurtful, and hateful toward LGBTQ people. So sad to say, this has been true of some Christians. Some Christian churches have practiced a mean-spirited form of discrimination against LGBTQ people. These very unfortunate instances of Christian bigotry toward LGBTQ people have been trumpeted by LGBTQ activists as evidence that all Christians, and particularly Bible-believing evangelicals, are hateful toward LGBTQ people. Another reason why this strategy is so effective is because almost nobody likes being labeled as being hateful. This is why so many Christians are afraid to speak out against LGBTQ behavior. They are afraid that they might offend others, especially LGBTQ people, because there are LGBTQ people who will become extremely upset and begin shouting at those who say their behavior is wrong. And this kind of response makes many people feel uncomfortable. In this case, remaining silent is not being loving. In fact, remaining silent may actually be harmful to the sinner because they are not being confronted with their sin or the consequences of their sinful behaviors. Even worse would be to affirm LGBTQ people in such a way that they are actually encouraged to continue their sinful behaviors. I once recently heard a video blogger talk about loving people to hell. This may be an extreme statement, but this expresses the idea that I'm talking about. If we don't confront LGBTQ people about their behaviors, that is not a loving thing to do. Because if they continue in this behavior, if they refuse to repent, if they refuse to turn to Christ for forgiveness, they will go to hell. That is very unpleasant to say, but it's the truth. Now, the third step in the LGBTQ cultural agenda is to convert society to accept and celebrate LGBTQ identities. This is the end goal of many LGBTQ activists, because once this stage is reached, there will no longer be any opposition whatsoever to LGBTQ people or to LGBTQ behaviors. Or if there is any opposition left, it will be so minor as to be inconsequential. Now, going hand in hand with the cultural agenda is the political agenda of the LGBTQ movement. So the first step in the political agenda is to decriminalize same-sex behavior. Even as simple a step as not enforcing existing laws against same-sex behavior often lead to outright decriminalization of laws against same-sex behavior. This is what has happened in Singapore with Article 377A. In 2007, Singapore's parliament decided they would no longer enforce Article 377A. It would still remain in the legal code, but they would no longer enforce it. But that decision in 2007 then led to the actual removal of Article 377A in 2022. So that's the first step in the political agenda of the LGBTQ movement, to decriminalize same-sex behavior. The second step in their political agenda is to enact anti-discrimination laws. These laws would prohibit discrimination against LGBTQ people in areas such as employment, housing, healthcare, transportation, etc. This step is often compared to similar steps in the American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, when African Americans successfully campaigned for an end to discrimination in employment, public housing, medical care, transportation, and many other areas of life. The move to remove discrimination against LGBTQ people is often an ongoing project. As a country becomes more accepting of LGBTQ people and behaviors, anti-discrimination laws will gradually affect more and more areas of public life, such as allowing transgender people to use the restroom of whatever gender they identify with, the inclusion of transgender people in athletic events, etc. So this is the second step in the political agenda of the LGBTQ movement. The third step in the political agenda of LGBTQ movement is to introduce LGBTQ-friendly lessons into public schools. You may have heard the proverb, "The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world." And that is exactly, and that proverb describes this step of the political agenda. The goal of this step is the indoctrination of children into LGBTQ ideology. This often involved the development and teaching of LGBTQ-friendly lessons at all grade levels, from kindergarten all the way to university and beyond. Okay, so this is the goal is to indoctrinate school children so that they will become pro-LGBTQ, or in the language of the LGBTQ movement, they will become allies of LGBTQ people. The fourth step in the political agenda is to legalize same-sex marriage. Like the decriminalization of same-sex behavior, this step may be preceded by a smaller step. For example, in the United States, many states in the 1990s began legalizing same-sex civil unions, which allowed same-sex couples some, but not all, of the same rights as heterosexual married couples. So this is another step in part of the LGBTQ political agenda. And a fifth step in the political agenda of the LGBTQ movement is to legalize adoption for same-sex couples. This is another important goal of the LGBTQ movement because, by definition, same-sex couples cannot have children naturally. Some lesbian couples will try to have children by having one partner become impregnated with sperm from a sperm donor. However, this is a very costly and often ineffective path to having children. Adoption, while also quite expensive, does not involve any of the risks that accompany IVF treatments. So we've looked at the cultural and political agendas of the LGBTQ movement. Now let's look at the personal dimension of the LGBTQ movement. How does the LGBTQ movement play out in the lives of ordinary people? Here's how the LGBTQ movement often plays out in the lives of children. First, a child announces that they're a different gender, okay? They immediately change their name and preferred pronouns. This child will often be affirmed by teachers and others at school because, remember, part of the LGBTQ agenda is to introduce LGBTQ-friendly lessons to school children. So that often includes placing LGBTQ teachers or LGBTQ friendly teachers in public schools as well. And so when these children decide they're a different gender, they will be affirmed by their teachers and others at school who have already been indoctrinated in this ideology. The second step is transgender children will then visit a doctor, many of whom are also now affirming, and many of whom now also believe it's their job to help trans children to transition to the gender or sex they identify with. This step involves a self-diagnosis by the child. This means there are no external means by which a doctor can or cannot say that a child who presents as one sex or gender is actually another sex or gender. This all relies on what the child himself or herself says. So that's why this is a self-diagnosis. So once a child has visited a doctor, the next step is puberty blockers are then given to the trans child. Prescriptions for puberty blockers are given to the trans child, and these drugs stop the normal production of hormones that will cause that child to develop the physical expression of their particular sex. Again, this step is done based solely on the self-diagnosis of the trans child, and often without any need for parental consent. Then the next step in this process is the start of cross-sex hormones. These hormones will begin the stimulation of the physical expression of another sex in the trans child's body. A boy will begin to look more like a girl, and a girl will begin to look more like a boy. Now, here's the thing. Almost 100% of children who start puberty blockers will progress to cross-sex hormones. Now, one very serious effect of cross-sex hormones is that these hormones will make the trans child sterile. Once trans children begin taking cross-sex hormones, they will never be able to have biological children ever. Now, there is no long-term data, but there is the very real possibility that even puberty blockers could affect trans children's future ability to have biological children. Now, these changes are permanent, and there are growing numbers of people who have gone through gender transition and now regret having done so. However, going back to one's original sex is a very difficult process. The end result of sex changes often includes impaired body function, including urination and sexual intercourse. So this whole business of sex change is really very, very problematic in many different ways. So now we've looked in this second video, what we've done is we've looked at some of the LGBTQ interpretation of key biblical passages regarding human sexuality and gender. And we've contrasted that with what the Bible actually does say about human sexuality and gender. Then we've looked at the agenda of the LGBTQ movement. We've looked at their cultural agenda, their political agenda, and then we've looked at how the LGBTQ movement often plays out at the personal level, especially in terms of the transgender aspect of the LGBTQ movement. What we're going to do now is we're going to go to part 3, in which we will begin to try to craft a strategy for telling the better story about human sexuality and gender. So please go to the 3rd video and we'll continue this lesson.